everyone, Armoured Pants here, and I have a new video for you in the British line, a tank which is currently in the shop for sale. It's the Tier 10 TD, the Badger, or fighting vehicle FV217. This is quite an interesting tank. In many ways, this is a missing link of a tank, right? It's basically the Tier 10 which should follow the Tortoise, right? Because the Death Star it doesn't really belong there. It kind of really sticks out, right? It's very different to the tanks that go before it. So it's good to have a look at this tank. But before we do that, just a quick reminder, a couple of weeks ago we opened up the Discord channel for this YouTube channel. So please come along and join us there. A lot of great tankers, great people, and some other YouTubers as well. Now, going back to the tech spec for this tank, which we'll have a look at presently, and we'll use blitzhanger.com for that. I thought beforehand we would have a look at the current offer which is in the shop. So in the EU server it's 20,000 gold, right, which is basically 55 to 60 euro, which is a fucking shit ton of money, right, for basically what is a set of binary code on a server and a pixelated animated tank. So that firstly is, I would say, a big negative about this tank, right? In terms of a collectible tank, we always want to see what the credit coefficient is. So it's 150%. It's the third highest in Tier 10. But compare that to the top credit earners at Tier 8, for example, it falls way behind. So if you want to look just for a credit earner, buy something like a Super Pershing or a Luva at Tier 8. They have a far superior credit coefficient. Now, this tank, though, does have one dimension which you may not be familiar with, which is HESH shells. So I thought it would be good to have a mini tutorial on that. So I'm going to hand you over to the boffins.
HESH high explosive squash head, HEAT high explosive anti-tank. These two rounds first saw use in World War II. For these ammo types, distance or kinetic energy are not a factor once they reach their target. HESH is a slow-speed round that uses concussive explosive energy to damage the interior of the target. HESH contains a thin casing with a plastic explosive that flattens against the target before exploding. Once the round is partially squashed, the plastic explosive ignites. The concussive energy transfers through, and pieces of the armor or equipment inside become the destructive elements. HEAT contains an inverted cone-shaped charge with a metallic liner. Once the round reaches the target, it detonates, creating a molten metal hypersonic jet. This explosively formed penetrator requires standoff distance to form its maximum penetrating power. Research has shown the more angled the cone is, the more concentrated the jet becomes, increasing its force and penetration distance. Advances in technology have mitigated these effects, such as explosive reactive armor and composite armor with ceramic plates and other materials. Spaced or slat armor also reduces the effects due to causing premature detonation.
Hope you got all of that, but if you didn't, don't worry, just rewind it and watch it again. Now, in terms of the setup of this tank, I would run improved fuel, T, and putting in T. Well, I mean, it is a British tank, so the more T, the better, right? In terms of the gun system, I would run calibrated shells, supercharged, refined gun. Calibrated shells is important of this because of the HESH pen, which we're going to have a look at in a second. Now, it has a Tier 10 gun, it has a 123mm gun system, has quite a bit of punch, and has an 8.6 second reload, so has a very decent rate of fire for a Tier 10 heavy. And as we said, sort of very similar playing characteristics to the Tortoise before it, and that whole line of tanks, the 18 line, right? And as we said, the sort of Death Star sticks out there. So this would be better being in the tech tree, and the Death Star would better off being thrown into a bin and forgotten about and never spoken of again. Now, in terms of pen, this tank does 294mm of pen with AP, 389 with APCR, but disappointingly only 72mm with HESH. If you compare that to the pen on the Tortoise, it's really, really disappointing, particularly when you consider that they want you to spend a lot of money on this tank, right? So the HESH is disappointing. But of course, that's why you need to run calibrated shells, because you need to improve the penetration with that HESH. Now, the muzzle velocity is 1,000 meters per second with AP and HESH, and you get a 25% boost on that, going up to 1250 meters per second with APCR. In terms of damage, you're going to do 460 damage on average with AP, 390 with APCR, and 550 plus with HESH. That's the great advantage of HESH, and why I said it's disappointing that the pen is only 72mm on this tank. Gun depression is 10 degrees, excellent. 20 degrees of elevation, so excellent gun alignment with this tank. And it also has plus minus 20 degree arc, aiming arc, sorry, plus minus 10 degree, giving 20 degree aiming arc, so also please take note of that. In terms of top speed, it does 30 kilometers per hour, 12 in reverse, but the power to weight ratio sucks, so you're not going to get anywhere quickly in this tank. Gun index is 13.7, which is also pretty disappointing, and that's mainly down to the low muzzle velocity. If you consider that compared to other tier 10 TDs, like a grill, for example, that has a gun handling index of 20, right? So this is way beyond that. It's a 70% difference. So that's significantly less than what you would expect from a tier 10 heavy, right? Mobility index is only 1.8 as well, so it's very low. But as I said, that is in line with what you expect from this AT line of tanks, of which this tank is kind of that genre. And like that AT line of tanks, this tank has limited map engagement. Now, if you haven't watched the AT Tortoise line of reviews on the channel, basically that means that because it has such low mobility, you can't get around the map. It means that your gameplay is going to be confined to a limited area of the map. That means you need to plan your gameplay very carefully, because if you make the wrong move at the start, you can't really correct it. So you need to be very, very aware of that and plan accordingly. A wrong move at the start can see the whole game pass you by. And particularly if you haven't played the AT line before and haven't dealt with this lack of mobility, you need to take note of this tank. And I'm conscious of the fact that some of you may have never played that line of tanks and simply bought this tank, and then you want to play it having never played similar type tanks before. So please be aware that you need to be very conscious of that aspect of the gameplay of this tank. Now, in terms of its concealment numbers, a tank with a view range of 308 meters will spot this tank up at 199 meters, so it means it has really, really good concealment numbers. But also please take note, when you fire, even if you're in cover, you blow over 50 meters of concealment. So you may be well outside the view range of another tank, you fire and you come within the view range, you get spotted up, so please be aware of that. Now let's have a look at the armor profile. And when we have a look at the armor profile in some detail and 3D imaging here, you're going to see that it is very, very similar to the AT line. And that's why I say this is in many ways the missing link, this tank. It is the tier 10 tank which should be at the top of the AT line after the Tortoise, and not the Death Star. The Death Star is a completely different game style and shouldn't really be there. This would be much more in line with what you'd expect. As you can see, you can side scrape in this tank. It has brilliant frontal armor. It's going to get you bounces. We're going to have a look at that in gameplay as well. You have this spaced armor on the sides that's going to protect you from HESH and HE rounds. It's also going to save your tracks occasionally. But like all British tanks, on the back you are vulnerable. The butt of this tank has virtually no armor. Even medium and light tanks can pen you with HE. Right, so you need to be aware of that. The best positioning for this tank is with the enemy in front of you, and if it's possible to have something behind you. Just think about it like you are a very good looking guy who's just gone to a maximum security prison, right? Having your ass to a solid object all the time, especially when you're in the showers, is definitely going to pay dividends, and it's the same with this tank, right? So, this tank is very vulnerable from behind. You really need to pay attention to where your butt is, particularly vis-a-vis those other prisoners. Sorry, I mean the red tanks. So, having a look here at the front profile, we see that it is trollish armor. Really, the only vulnerable part is that lower plate. So be aware, if you can protect that, and you can, of course, because you've got that 10 degrees of gun depression, this tank can deliver time and time again. If you get into a hold down position in this tank, you're only exposing the top part of that of the hull. You will bounce shots, and you're going to see that in the gameplay as well. It's going to be in Fort Despair. You're going to see me doing that. In terms of tactics, you can go front line in this tank. Not ideal, but you can do it. It has the armor to do it. But ideally, playing as traditional TD, farming damage, using that good rate of fire, that good gun system. The gun is accurate, has low dispersion. Okay, it's not as good as the grill, but it has a decent gun handling index. Also, unlike many turretless TDs, it has a relatively smooth traverse when you're doing tracking shots because it has that 20 degrees of aiming arc. So if you remember, we did a review of the SU-101. We said you have a thing called track bump when you're traversing because the aiming arc is only plus minus 3 degrees. So therefore, when you're doing a tracking shot, particularly on a high-speed tank, you get track bump. The tracks have to move. You get bump. You lose your aiming. That's not the case in this tank, and we'll also show an example of that in the gameplay. As I said, we're going to have a look at a Supremacy game on Fort Despair. This is actually ends up as a third-class master game, but more importantly, a Kolobanov medal. By the way, one of the easier Kolobanov medals I've ever gotten, because I think I was in a Kolobanov situation for literally about 10 seconds in the game. But nonetheless, a Kolobanov medal. But I think I wanted to show this game because it's a good illustration of the tanks. Advantages, as we just discussed in the tech spec, and also some of its disadvantages. So one of its disadvantages, as we see here quite clearly, is that it is fucking treacle slow, right? It's like watching fucking paint grow. Grass grow, paint dry. Either of those two activities, that's what it's like, right? I mean, you literally go off, make a cup of that fucking tea that we spoke about earlier, come back, and you just be in position, right? But once you get into position, we're going to see some of the advantages in play here, right? And those advantages are this really trollish frontal armor, particularly on the top of the tank, and you're going to see some massive bounces coming up, and we're going to see the gun system in play as well, right? So this is an example coming up right here, right? Spot the grill, boom, shot into him, roll back. I'm only now exposing the top part of my armor. I'm going to see that in play now when we come back, because they've spotted me up there. They know I'm here. Look at that. Boom, boom. Big bounces from big guns there. And that's what you can do in this tank. So normally, if I was in a waffle tractor or a grill, I would reset camo when I pull back. But in this tank, you don't have to, because I know I'm protecting the bottom vulnerable part of my tank with the wall in front of me here. And I get a bounce. That was 2 bounces when I come back. Another bounce here, and you're thinking, oh, you got pen there, armored. Well, did I really? That's a HE shot. You're right. It's a tiny, tiny alpha roll, right? So I have no idea why the prog was firing a HE around me, you know. But he did just double-digit damage points, so it's not really a pen at all, right? And then there he is sitting there, and we're just able to put a nice round into him. Again, we're spotted up again, but you know, you don't really need to bother resetting camo. I'm running camo net in this as well, because when you're popping up like that, you know, and only exposing the top of this tank, it's almost impossible to pen with any sort of high rolls. If somebody wants to low roll you for 20 hit points with a HE round, fair enough. So, you know, again, advantages, disadvantages now coming up. Here they are. Look how slow it is, right? You're not going to be able to get around the map in this tank. If you're in a situation where you need to cap bases at the end of a game and you're in this tank, forget about it. It ain't happening, buddy. But where it's really good is in situations like this, where the enemy is in front of you, right? I want to slow this down and show it to you again, because it illustrates exactly what we spoke about in the tech spec. The smoother tracking shots because of that plus minus 10 or 20 degree in total traverse on it, aiming arc rather. Here we see the gun system, particularly at shorter distances where the muzzle velocity doesn't come into play too much. You will be able to make those really, really accurate shots into small targets, as I did there on the prog. You saw there another bounce. If you're up against medium and light tanks front on, they're going to find it almost impossible to pen you. Bigger things like E100, Death Star, etc., yes, they have more options in their gun systems, but something like the Progetto 65 here will find it very, very difficult to pen you. Now, this position I'm going to get into here, which ultimately results in the Kolobanov, is the kind of perfect situation you want to be in this tank. And that is my butt protected. So as we said, like that shower scene in Shawshank Redemption, right? Butt protected. I've got a nice solid object behind me. I'm angling up in front. I get that big bounce off the object, able to clear him off. You know, okay, I take one shot, but it's very, very difficult for them to pen me. You know, they have to come onto my front E75 here, pen him easily, get another bounce, and as I said, a very, very easy Kolobanov. delivered. But overall, 5.5k net damage, and we've spoken about the importance of net damage before on this tank, on this channel, right? We've spoken about it often. You know, there's only 3.2k of actual damage, but 2.2k of bounce damage. Bounce damage is really, really important because that's damage that could be inflicted on your teammates and ultimately result in you losing. And net damage has as much of a positive effect on the game as just normal damage dealt. We've discussed that many times on channel, but you know, it really is important, and you should be judging yourself as a player on your net contribution, not just the damage that you do, because as we said, every shot that you bounce is a shot that could have penned one of your allies or yourself and reduced the total hit points of your team. So there we go. As I said, you know, nothing spectacular in terms of the gameplay there. A third class mastery badge, but a Klobanoff medal. As I said, one of the easiest Klobanoffs you're ever going to get. But with the tank I have there in play and the position I was in, I would have been confident that I would have been able to get it. If we weren't playing Supremacy, I would have been able to get a Klobanoff anyway, because, you know, front on to the enemy with your butt protected, this tank is very, very effective, especially with that trollish frontal armor and that gun system. Now, let's have a recap, shall we, of the key points about this tank. But before we do that, let's just go back to what I was saying earlier about the Death Star, you know, because the Death Star, you know, if you see my review, I think it's a total shit box, right? Absolute shit box. And you know, one of my clan members sent a ticket to Wargame. They replied back to him and said, oh yeah, well, yeah, actually, in our opinion, the Death Star is well balanced. And I was thinking, geez, that's bullshit. But if you think about it, they're probably right, because if every aspect of the tank is equally shit, then it is well balanced, right? QED. It's a well balanced shit box. So, you know, if I were wargaming, I'd fuck that out, and I would, or buff it. It needs a serious buff, and I maybe stick something like this into the tech tree line, and then maybe have the Death Star as a collectible, or a premium tank, but a proper one with, you know, restoring some of its camo numbers and some of its gun handling, etc. Anyway, let's go back to the recap on this tank. So this is a very slow moving tank, but like the AT range, is a slow moving wall of death, like a Roman legion coming towards you. It has that inevitability of death about it. But it is also a binary tank, right? And what do we mean by that? Well, it's very hit and miss, right? If you go the wrong way at this opening of a game, the whole game can pass you by. This tank has decent concealment and has a decent gun system, so they definitely play into its role as a TD. And it is quite effective in that role. Its rate of fire is good. The 8.6 second reload is really, really good. And you saw there in the game, you know, it is very effective, particularly when the enemy's in front of you. The gun system is odd though, because it's not as good as the tech tree in terms of the pen on the HESH, and there's no real explanation for that really. The mobility is also poor, and therefore you have limited map engagement, which we spoke about during the tech spec. So therefore you need to choose your opening carefully. Setup analysis is key. Have a look at the setup, particularly the TDs, fast movers, heavies, etc., and see where you think the gameplay is going to unfold and move accordingly. Because if you don't get that right, as I said, the game can pass you by and you don't have the speed or mobility to get back into play. Frontal armor is great, particularly at the top of the hull. The lower plate is a bit vulnerable, but because of that gun depression of 10 degrees, if you can get into a hold down position, then you are winner chicken dinner all day long in this tank. And it's a decent tank, and as I said, probably the missing link in that AT Tortoise tech tree line, right? But that said, it's a lot of fucking money. 60 euros for a tank is a shit ton of money, and I don't really know if it's worth that, because it is nothing spectacular, right? But it's up to you guys, of course. But if you've got that money to spend, then by all means go ahead. But for me, it just seems to be a lot of money for what is just a decent tank, nothing special. Thanks for watching. Hope you found it useful. Hope you found it enjoyable. And I guess all that remains for me now to say is pants off.